This is our PowerPoint on the 1980s, very different decade that had preceded it. And it began with the election of a new president right at the dawn of the new decade. And as you guys will see, a lot of what that president did really kicked off a decade of prosperity and a lot of rejuvenated hope in the American dream throughout this decade. The decade would be popularized by the end of the Cold War, the explosion, a new explosion of American pop culture, and many iconic Americanized things that came out of the decade, as well as some new tragedies as well. In 1980, the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was elected president of the United States in an overwhelmingly uh, large landslide over the previous president, Jimmy Carter, who really had been saddled with all of a number of unfortunate burdens that were not a lot under his control, but what resulted in his political failure. Ronald Reagan came in with a whole new look at ways of dealing with the economy, an economy that had stalled for much of the 1970s. His basic idea was nicknamed Reaganomics, and it wasn't exactly a new idea, but the basic idea behind it was also referred to as trickle-down economics. And essentially what Reagan called for was deregulation, reductions on government spending, tax cuts for both individuals and corporations. In other words, what he wanted to do was he wanted to ease a lot of the government restrictions on big business in America. Now, based on his theory, the idea was that if big business in the United States was not saddled with so many taxes or government restrictions, it would then be allowed to grow and do what government did, do what business, not government, do what government does best, and that is make money and hopefully also in the process create jobs. It's not a coincidence that when Ronald Reagan became president, the presidential portrait that he put up in the Oval Office, the private office of the president, as kind of his person that he admired, was Calvin Coolidge, who back in the 1920s was made famous by one of the few things he ever said, was that the business of America was business. And Reagan really held to that as being a possible solution to the economic problems that had really saddled the United States for most of the previous decade. And it made the decade prior to this one that was riddled with inflation, high unemployment, and a real slowing down of American industry as a whole. Now the question is, was Reaganomics in fact a success or a failure? You could probably take a whole series of economics classes in college to determine the answer to this question. But here it is in just a few points, both whether it can be considered a success or a failure. Reagan proposed a huge tax cut, and he didn't really get a lot of that. He did get a lot of tax relief for the rich, and that did allow corporations to invest a lot more money into their companies, growing them and creating jobs. The government actually ramped up its spending, especially when it came to defense contracts, military contracts. This also flooded the economy and created jobs in the contract military sector. So things like aircraft, tech, electronics, all these new private divisions that were now in which there were now new jobs being created because of government spending. So overall, we do see a growth in numbers of jobs throughout the 1980s. However, one of the downsides of Reaganomics was that in many cases, corporations, instead of creating jobs, invested their money in the stock market and in their own companies, and in the ability to buy out their competitors and put them out of business, which ultimately destroyed jobs in some cases. The other thing was that the increase in military spending, primarily due to Reagan's stand on the Cold War, was the one of the side effects was that we had skyrocketing deficits. A deficit is essentially a debt we owe ourselves in the American economy. So the question as to whether or not Reaganomics really was a success or a failure is a bit of a mixed bag. But even today, the overall opinion of Reaganomics throughout the 1980s was that it did, in fact, create jobs, and it did get the American economy out of the slump that it had been in the 1980s. Reagan was very much a hardliner when it came to the defense against communism. And Reagan promised that the American government would support those people fighting against communism throughout the world. And this policy continued in various places like El Salvador and several other locations throughout the Middle East. Where this policy was first tested was in 1983, where a recently elected government was overturned by revolutionaries. These revolutionaries were communists, and little did the American public know at the time, but they were actually being funded and supported by America's good old friend Cuba. Yes, the communist revolutionaries in Grenada were actually being funded and supplied by the communists in Cuba. Now, the Americans didn't know this at the time, but they discovered this because the United States did in fact send in the Marines to stop this revolution and support the democratically elected government on that little island. In addition, the United States also began to support anti-communist forces in Afghanistan. Now, in the late 70s, the Soviet Union had invaded the country and had been involved in a very long war there. And Afghanistan was very much the Soviet Union's Vietnam, in that by the end of that conflict, the Soviet Union really hadn't accomplished what they wanted to. They wanted to support a communist uprising in the country, and it just didn't happen. The United States, as typical during the Cold War, supported an anti-communist government, even though they weren't necessarily pro-democratic. They were just anti-communist. And an interesting little factoid, one of the people that was supported during that time in the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan was a man named Osama bin Laden. And he was actually directly supported by the United States. Interesting, huh? Another big military action that occurred during the Reagan years. In fact, during his extending between both of his two terms was a situation in the North African country of Libya. A number of Marines were killed in Lebanon in 1983, 239 Marines, where a truck loaded with explosives smashed into a base in that Middle Eastern country and exploded, killing those Marines. The CIA linked those terrorists to a group based out of the country of Libya. And when it was discovered that this is where they were based 3 years later, the United States, under the command of Ronald Reagan, launched a bombing that also included the leader of the country. And although the leader of the country was not killed, a lot of the terrorists were eliminated. Reagan was demonstrating that he, in fact, was willing to use American muscle again. After a decade of being very timid and worried about this, Reagan showed a willingness to use American military might to enforce American foreign policy around the world, whether it be a reaction against terrorists or a carrying out of America's Cold War policies. And so in many ways, the United States becomes much more aggressive throughout the 1980s. Now, as we mentioned here, this situation in Libya took place between 1983 and 1986. In the meantime, Reagan wins an overwhelming election in 1984. Reagan is reelected by one of the largest landslides ever to that date. In fact, no president since then, since 1984, has ever won by as much as Ronald Reagan did. And it really signaled just how popular both he and his administration was, and that was the United States was back on its feet, socially, economically, even as far as foreign policy, where they were positioned as far as other countries throughout the world. The Reagan years, though, were not free of scandal. Reagan himself became embroiled in a scandal that ended somewhat ambiguously. In other words, we don't really know or understand how it really ended. Throughout the 1980s, Reagan pledged support to anybody fighting against communist insurgents or communist rebels. Reagan had proposed helping what were called the Contras in Nicaragua. And the whole idea behind this was that the Contras were fighting against a communist force called the Sandinistas. And the basic idea here was that Reagan asked for help for Congress to fund the Contras, and the Congress basically said, no, we do not want any direct connection between the American government and this force. Reagan supposedly went around Congress by authorizing sales of arms to Iran. The profit from these sales was then sent as support to the Contras, who would then buy arms in support of their anti-communist cause. Now, while no connection was ever conclusively proven directly between Reagan and what became known as the Iran-Contra affair, Reagan did go on the media, on the news, on a live broadcast, and say that he did take responsibility for it happening, although he himself may have not been the one who did it. The military personnel who carried it out have always maintained that they received orders directly from the President of the United States during this process. It was borne out later in a hearing that that may or may not have been the case. And so, like I said, the ending of this situation is somewhat in ambiguity. In other words, we're not really sure. Did Reagan do it? Didn't he? One of the most remarkable things that happens during the Reagan years, especially during his second administration, beginning in 1984, is his relationship with the leader of the Soviet Union, who at this time was a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev, or Gorby, as he was nicknamed here in the United States, was seen as quite a new leader of the Soviet Union. He really wanted to steer the Soviet Union away from what they had always been known as, and that is this very terrible, oppressive kind of people. He wanted the economy to kind of get up and start opening it up again. It's what he called glasnost. He introduced a whole program of what he called perestroika, or reform, where they would allow people in the Soviet Union to actually run their own shops, make their own money. It was kind of a limited way to allow the Soviet economy to try to get up and going again, because it, like the economy of the United States, had slowed far more than the American economy, and was suffering during this time. The Soviet economy was showing that it could not actually support its people, and it was going bankrupt because of its huge defense budget, which it was trying to expand to try and keep up with the United States. At one point, Reagan visited the Berlin Wall, and he called out Gorbachev, and he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall." And what he really did was he opened up a dialogue between himself and the new Soviet leader. And this was a dialogue unlike anything else. The two leaders had immense respect for one another and had a great relationship. And this was unique in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in fact, what ended up happening was that the two leaders actually managed to sign an intermediate nuclear forces treaty, which for the first time conclusively eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapon being used in the United States and the Soviet Union, or at least being built. And this is a real sign that the times were, in fact, changing between the United States and the Soviet Union. And maybe the Cold War might actually be at an end. The 80s also turned out to be a huge decade when it came to pop culture. In the 1980s, the cable channel MTV made cable television actually a huge thing that people wanted to see. Nickelodeon became a huge cable channel for kids, and a number of other cable, basically a subscription TV service, brought in all kinds of new media and forms of entertainment through television. And in addition, new technology also brought in new forms of entertainment and information into people's private home. The video cassette recorder, or VCR, for the first time allowed people to actually record and store things that were shown on TV to have for future use. And then, of course, also movie companies began producing their movies on tape for people to buy. So now you could watch movies at home. Movie rental places became a big thing. MTV in particular really changed the face of music, because now music stars not only had to produce great records, but they also made these short movie-like vignettes that would go along with their various songs. And those short videos, those music videos, also served to popularize the record and the kind of music that they were playing at the time. One of the biggest technological advances for Americans during the 1980s was the personal computer. As you guys see there too, the Apple II and the Macintosh were some of the first big things to really come into the American home. The idea now that you can have this kind of computing power in your own home was absolutely revolutionary. And of course, a decade later, in the late 90s, connections between these computers would show the birth of the internet, but things weren't quite there yet. People were still on their own computers at home. And so American pop culture really took on its own style, its own look in the 1980s. Unfortunately, though, there was also a dark side to American culture in the 1980s. One was the acceleration of drug use. Illegal narcotics, everything from marijuana to heroin to something that was called crack cocaine, began to see all over throughout American cities. Drug addiction became a huge issue, became a huge medical issue throughout the 1980s, to the point where the administration, under the leadership of the president's own wife, began a program targeting young children to just say no. And this, of course, was the DARE program. I can remember being in elementary school and having a DARE police officer come in and talk about the dangers of drug use, not just from a legal point of view, but the health risks as well. One of the largest health risk in the 1980s was the AIDS epidemic, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, a disease that spread not only through sexual contact, but also through the use of intravenous drug use, where you use needles, anything where it came into the body in either of those ways. This disease effectively destroyed the body's immune system. And throughout the 1980s, it spread like a wildfire, and people became very paranoid about AIDS, how you could get it, how did you behave around somebody who you knew already had it. The deadly disease was most commonly communicated by sexual contact, as well as the use of intravenous needles. And so the drug culture, along with AIDS, there became a connection there. Unfortunately, it was largely the homosexual community throughout the United States where the AIDS epidemic took its worst toll. For many years, it wasn't even known as to what the disease actually was before this very mysterious term finally had a name. And throughout the 80s and 90s, money was raised to defeat this disease, and the battle continues. In 1988, with Reagan at the end of his constitutionally allowed 2 terms as president, His vice president, George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, ran for president to maintain Republican dominancy in the White House. And riding on the coattails of the Reagan Revolution, the Ronald Reagan years throughout the 1980s, Bush easily won the election over Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Bush, though, had a slightly different brand of conservatism. On many issues, it was known that he did not agree with his then commander-in-chief, Ronald Reagan. In fact, in 1980, Bush had openly criticized Reagan's economic policy, nicknaming it voodoo economics. However, throughout the 8 years as vice president, he loyally stood by his president's side. In 1988, though, he unveiled his own brand of what he called compassionate conservatism. During his time, Congress amended federal air pollution laws, creating tougher regulations on emissions from cars. Low-income families were helped by providing them low-cost childcare. Discrimination against disabled individuals was eliminated and outlawed, allowing food and other kinds of necessities to arrive to people who were disabled in some way. Immigration reform was conducted during the Bush years, which affected mostly people in Latin America. It's actually during this time period, during Bush's term as president, that immigration from south of the United States begins to accelerate. In addition, in 91, at the dawn of the next decade, Bush signed a Civil Rights Act which made it easier for workers to win anti-discrimination lawsuits. And so Bush really saw it as the job of government to also not only to care about the economy, but actually care about the individual lives of American citizens. It is during the early years of the Bush administration that the Cold War officially came to an end. In 1989, after a vote by both West and East Germany, Germany reunited. The East German government, otherwise known as the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, was dissolved, and Germany was reunited, and thousands of people tore down pieces of the Berlin Wall, this once literal concrete representation, a symbol of the division between the communist East and the democratic West, was disassembled. There is a section of it that still remains in Berlin as a reminder of that history, that almost 40-year period in which the people of Berlin were divided by a wall. In addition, the Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate. No longer willing to use the military to enforce its will on its Soviet satellite countries, the various former Soviet republics began to go their own independent way. And in fact, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into its component republics. And in Russia, the traditional Russian white, blue, and red flag was flown for the first time, and Russians, for the first time in over 80 years, actually ever, elected their own president, a man by the name of Boris Yeltsin. And so, by the time we get into the early years of the following decade, 40 plus years of the Cold War came to an end. And the world now was changed. The world now had seen all of this incredible change take place on TV. I watched on TV as they took down pieces of the Berlin Wall. I watched on TV as governments shook hands and parted ways, no longer under the control of the Soviet Union. I watched for the first time an Olympics in which the great red flag that had the hammer and sickle for so many years was gone and no longer flew in front of an Olympic team. But these changes also had an interesting effect on the United States government. President George H.W. Bush was looking forward to actually having money left over. Now no longer having to try and outspend on the military budget the Soviet Union, Bush was looking to have money left over in the American government to work on other programs throughout the United States. Unfortunately, a number of banks, and this is kind of hailing back to a little bit of what we saw happen during the Great Depression, had unwisely invested in high-risk loans, bonds. And at a critical juncture in 1991, a number of these banks went under and threatened to seriously impact on a very large scale the American economy. In fact, we can see the cover of this Time article right here. The black and white picture on the left is, of course, someone from the Depression shaking hands with the color picture from the 1990s on the right. And people are wondering, is this what we have to look forward to? In order to keep this from happening, George H.W. Bush felt it necessary to break a campaign promise he had made when he ran in 1988, where he very publicly looked out at all of his supporters and said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And in fact, he ended up having to break that promise. He ended up raising one small tax on gasoline to slow the effect of what became known as the recession of 1991. And as a result, in the following election that would end with the ending of George H.W. Bush's presidency, the person who was running against him, a governor from Arkansas, said, "It's all about the economy, stupid," and made sure people were looking at their pocketbooks when considering who to elect for president. So while George H.W. Bush definitely had a connection to the 1980s and the end of the Cold War, his transition into the first years of the following decade were not so good. All right, folks. Took a very brief look at a number of things from the 1980s in the United States during this time period. We're going to look at some other nuances of the decade when we see the Century series. The episode that will go with the 1980s called A Whole New World. And so what we're going to be looking at in your summary paragraph here, of course, is an overall change. Political change, economic change, and of course social change. We have changes in all three of those categories that we need to at least touch on when looking at the decade of the 1980s.